Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Behind the Podium, another week in which we look at the struggles, philosophies, and practices of the coach, healthcare practitioner, teacher, and any other person within that position of providing help to another individual. I am here, Jared Cohen, with my co-host,
Alexander Ellis.
And today we want to talk about continuing education and what that process entails as a coach is doing their best to continue to be a great example of what they have distilled to be true, as well as a part of that example, stay authentic to experimenting and constantly evolving and wanting to open themselves up to new ways of thinking. But obviously with that, there's always some cognitive dissonance and the struggle to embody that information enough yourself to then be able to share it with the people you work with.
Yeah, and I think there's also so many courses out there that seem interesting. Like my grocery list is shorter than the list of the courses I want to go take, but to be able to narrow it down and figure out, okay, which one is just purely for me, and which one is going to help elevate my coaching or my teaching, but also being willing to be maybe a little selfish if that's what you need to be, or maybe it does need to be more of a learning experience. So I commend you on actually pulling the trigger, picking something you wanted to do, and then going out and doing it. So I'm very excited to hear about your experience. What was the course you just completed?
So I just did Dr. Andreo Spina's Functional Range Conditioning Mobility Specialist Seminar Certification, which took place in Portland, Oregon at the Nike headquarters.
Did you get to go shopping?
I did not get to go shopping. It was very kind of dead because it was the weekend and it was rainy and cold.
It's Portland,
and the campus is huge. It rivals like a Big Ten school type of campus.
Wow!
So, like where I was in this fitness building seemed far from, like a small dot on this big campus map of like where I would even hope to find some cool merchandise.
Cool.
Yeah, so it was an experience, even just finding where I needed to go.
So, because I know the Nike headquarters is outside of Portland. Did you get to stay on the campus?
No, I actually stayed with a friend of mine from college in Portland, and then Ubered to Beaverton.
Whoa, that's a long Uber. Well, I'm sure everybody's wondering, since you were in Portland, did you go to Voodoo Donuts?
I did not go to Voodoo Donuts, but I did have, what was it called? I know Portland is famous for a particular kind of ice cream. And I actually went to a different one that my friend recently stumbled on, which was called Cloud City, I believe.
I'm writing this down.
If you're out there, it was fantastic. I am a sucker for good ice cream, and this friend of mine, shout out to Rhonda, this is the second really unique ice cream place that she has now brought me to. The first was in Santa Monica. and now I'm blanking on the name. Little Rose or something.
Lily Rose, or I don't know. I feel like we could also spend an entire episode talking about ice cream.
Ice cream is good.
I like to make ice cream at home, but okay, back to the point. Yeah. So how did you decide on this training?
So, so actually just side note to that, based on what you started with, which I think is an interesting thing, like because there's so many certifications and there's so many people doing, and even the word certification is a little misleading, right? Because you have like kind of seminars, or even, Yoga Tune-Up has these immersions, and really like it becomes a little nitty gritty when you then think of like what are the discerning characteristics of something being called a certification or a seminar. But anyway, what immediately popped to my mind is that it's now going to be 5 years in April since I got my CrossFit level 1, and they want me to recertify, which is like $500. And
do they require that of everybody?
Yeah, like it's just part of their, like it expires essentially. So it's one of those things I've been kind of like thinking about in terms of like, is that really necessary to do? And
CrossFit headquarters would say yes, of course.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But like, as far as like the people that I work for, like if they don't really care about it, right? And as far as like me thinking about my own education and like the other types of education that I want to continue taking advantage of, like, is that money and that time, worth just kind of continuing to at least stay like current from a logistical standpoint? Which I think piggybacks also on this piece of, nowadays, because of the internet, we're seeing so many really innovative thought leaders within this health and fitness space that have their own type of programs that haven't been around long enough to be sort of established within the hierarchy of more traditional accreditations, right? Like the NCSA, and like NASM, and like up until this point now, like I actually have a lot of certifications, but I don't have like your traditional ones per se. So it's something I like kind of think about where it's like, I feel like I've done a really unique job of like, of exposing myself to a wide breadth of stuff. But at the same time, like if I were to apply for, a more traditional, like, strength conditioning coach for like an athletic team, from their kind of traditional expectation of, like NASM and ACE, I would be sort of like not exactly aligning with that, right? The same way that, nowadays we're seeing a greater amount of alternative healthcare, functional medicine, chiropractors, even to some degree, acupuncturists versus like, your straight MD or even your like more traditional registered dietitian, and it's just another kind of interesting thing to think about in terms of being in this role and wanting to help people. What is that process of choosing education that is most fulfilling for you versus education that seems to be maybe somewhat of a split in how you're looking to kind of check boxes for, licensing, or even just how you want to be seen by others. Yeah.
And it's also important to consider, like you were saying, who your audience is and who your people are. Because it's not like you're going to drop everything and take a 180 and go be something else,
Right.
And it's the exact same thing for me in the yoga space. Yoga Alliance is totally. For many years, like the governing body, and I keep paying my dues because there are people who come to my trainings and workshops who want to get continuing education credits. So me maintaining that is important to continue to use that as an advertising tool. Like, hey, I'm a CEC provider.
That's a good point. Right, because you're still part of Yoga, by being still being a part of Yoga Alliance, you can offer that to them.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you also want to consider, and the general you is, if you were to let some sort of certification lapse and you wanted to go back and get it again, right? Do they require you to take the whole thing again? Is it, advantageous to just keep it going because you never know when you might need it? But I think it's also good to go to keep, I mean, just like you check your bank account, like keep looking like, okay, what have I done and where do I see myself, a year, 5 years from now? What of this is still serving me? What is not what I want to do, as opposed to just taking things willy-nilly.
Yeah, definitely. Right. So I guess back to this past weekend for me, I was introduced to Andreo Spina's work via the wonderful lens of Instagram.
Uh-huh.
I have another side note about that, so we can come back to that. But Instagram via my roommate, my former roommate, who he found him through Instagram, and one day was like, "Hey, are you familiar with this guy?" And I was like, "Oh no." And he started showing me some of Andreo Spina's videos, but more of like the videos that were being reposted by Spina for other people that had taken his course and then were utilizing his methods or system rather. And that's what really hooked me, was that it was clear that he had the type of teaching that was allowing people to take that information and be innovative in their own ways. And I just kept getting really intrigued by the type of applied movement proficiency that I was seeing with these various videos, both in a mindset sort of way that Andreo Spina's work is very much the antithesis of like doing something for time. It's very much about like honing in on your nervous system and the ability to like truly control the ranges that you have. And so I was really intrigued by the fact that like there was even just this large population of people that I was witnessing through social media that were like that were passionate about like, hey, look at me take my time and execute this like really cleanly. And that was like a nice kind of liberation for me in my own frustrations, like within my own coaching, within the CrossFit space, like to see a different community taking this movement mobility stuff and having a little bit more success, at least in how they viewed it, versus even just in the CrossFit space, treating mobility like another means to be kind of pain loving, faster, but also just like, this concept of like, oh, like it's a little sadistic at the end of the day. Right. Like I like, smashing, right? Like if it, it needs to hurt to work type of thing. So anyway,
now, the Andreo Spina students, are they mostly body weight type of stuff?
That's what it seems like. It seems like he attracts more of the body weight calisthenics type of athletes. Definitely, Andreo Spina's background is in martial arts from like a very young age, like 5 years old. So you can see that there's a lot of influence of that type of body control. But it's cool. Like, a lot of the stuff that is coming out nowadays is you're seeing a lot of recycling of like some really old solid ideas, but contextualized within a better scientific understanding of movement and biomechanics. And that's very much what he's brought to the table. But it was cool to know that he also, he's worked with a lot of different sport teams now. And just after he left Portland, he was going to Chicago and essentially giving the same FRC seminar to the Chicago Cubs staff.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it's cool to see that proliferation of ideas within, these different populations, from, your regular personal trainer to, staff that are taking care of very expensive athletes.
Yeah, very expensive. And what type of people were in the course?
I'm not really sure. There wasn't the whole kind of yoga tune-up vibe where we got to like go around in a circle and give our kind of like 140
Share
characters.
feeling.
Yeah. And I was actually like sort of purposely kind of conscious of not like letting my like a CrossFit identity be known.
Right. You left all your gym shirts at home.
Yeah. So I also thought about that, like at the same time, while it seems like maybe other CrossFit coaches aren't here, maybe they are. They're just also like choosing an incognito sort of stance. But it seemed like there was at the very least, it kind of split down the middle between just sort of coaches and manual therapists.
Oh.
Because he also has so like FRC is kind of his more applied training methodology for his system. And then he has like his functional range release, which is the manual therapy side of the equation. And the two integrate very similar to Yoga Tune-Up's curriculum, in which you have the longer term certification, but then you have all these immersion-based things, and you get kind of a threading of the different expertise, and also a diversity of teachers that have kind of like one or two, and then teachers that are like fully integrated.
Mm-hmm. So is this the FRC system? Do you have to start with this training first before you go on to the other ones?
You do not. So the other ones are there. He has 3 functional range release ones, which are spine, hips, and shoulders, I believe. And you don't you can take everything, or you can start at any point. I think what is good potentially about starting with the FRC, even if you are some kind of manual therapist, is that the FRC really is the applied aspect. And I really liked his approach and how he said, like, look, I'm going to speak to everyone here as if you are a coach and a manual therapist. Because like to him, he believed there is no separation really. And that ultimately, right, like both are needed. And so you have to kind of understand the language as it relates to like everybody in the same room. Because, you may sort of also like knowing your scope of practice, right? Like if I'm working with someone within the training setting, I also have to kind of like understand some of these assessment points to know when it's time for someone to like potentially be seen by a functional range release practitioner to kind of clear some of the stuff that we're unable to get through in just a training stimulus. And then now that person comes back to me and now we work through some of that stuff, right? But it's never like necessarily just one or the other. And especially from like the manual therapy side of it, like that's never going to be the end all be all. And he, was like very much in that self-empowered space of speaking to like, here are the tools, and, all of my clients that I see, like they have these tools in which to assess themselves on a daily basis, so that like, I'm not one of these chiropractors who says, hey, come back and see me in 3 to 4 weeks. It was like, no, like you have these things that you can do. And based on those things that you do, you will know if you need to come back and see me. And, and that was, another one of these nice overarching points of similarity that, at the very least, confirmed and validated my choice to take on this additional piece of education, that it was coming from somebody that is at least sharing that context of how to help empower other people and not be so hell-bent on like, safeguarding the material, right? That like, this is about like, closing down or getting rid of the gatekeepers, so to speak.
Cool. Now, is there more work you have to do to go through with the full certification?
There is not more work. There's not more required work, to be clear. I'm actually really excited. This is the first certification seminar. This is the first like continuing education thing I've ever done in which I have like a membership login to his site in which like all of the lectures he has like pre-recorded. So obviously they weren't like, they're not the same from my event, but like, from whenever he did these, like, the kind of base curriculum for all the lectures, there is, the videos there, so I can rewatch and re-listen to the lectures, as well as there's videos of the various exercises that speak to the various pieces of the system, and so I'm excited to be able to kind of have that at my disposal, especially because there was a lot of like science heavy stuff that really acted as the underpinning for making sense out of how all these pieces go together, and wanting to make sure that I can continue to revisit that and peel that back further and further as in other spaces I kind of get more sense of the science playing in with the applied aspect of the movement pieces.
Did you do any work ahead of time in preparation?
The work I did ahead of time really was just over the past year of playing with the pieces of stuff that I had been exposed to, like, obviously first starting with Instagram, but then being, a better student than that, to just stop there and listening to some various podcasts that he'd had, reading up on some of the other free content that was available through his YouTube account, and then starting to just play with the pieces based on, the systems that I have been honored to take into my own education, whether it's Yoga Tune-Up or Kelly Starrett's Movement and Mobility, and kind of figure out, where they worked nicely and where they complemented the other stuff, so that I went in there not being cold to any of this stuff. And I think that's really a key point for any sort of continuing education you do, especially if it's something that is being presented by like one person very specifically. I still to this day feel that CrossFit is doing a disservice to anybody that goes to that level 1 certification by the mere fact that like anyone is allowed to go there. And so essentially you are learning amongst a group of people who could have like 10 years of experience with CrossFit, or literally one day, or like somebody that chose to, instead of like taking advantage of all the free content of like CrossFit stuff online, chose to like have their first exposure to CrossFit be, $1,000 and this 2-day certification. And I think the problem with that is it then, it really dumbs down the type of discourse that then can be live in that setting, right? When you have to kind of speak to people that, are hearing this for the first time.
Totally.
And of course, like Spina's stuff is still, like it obviously has a pretty big following, be it that like, it was sold out, but what's nice is it's still small enough that it's very like self-selected. And it's not something that like people are doing, that's the problem with CrossFit now is like, there's people that are doing it, are going to those certs potentially for the wrong reasons, more of like a business agenda, because that's the only way you can start, right? You can start an affiliate. So, so again, that changes the interaction.
Everybody has different things they want to get out of it. And that was interesting what you said, because when I went to my level 1 for Yoga Tune-Up, I hadn't even been exposed to Yoga Tune-Up really. I had met Jill in person, and based on just, our conversation and a little bit about my background, she was like, "Oh, you would love our teacher training." And I'm like, "What? Another teacher training?" Yeah. And so I didn't know anything. I mean, I just had gotten my own pair of therapy balls and wasn't 100% sure how to use them. And then the flip side of that is like the CrossFit certification, and what you're saying too is like people go just because they want, like another piece of paper on the wall, or they want to open a business or, an affiliate. Because I've toyed with the idea of doing the level 1, just because, obviously still in the yoga space, but I don't want to discount the CrossFit space, and still trying to navigate and figure out what I want to do. And if, sometimes you do have to have these extra letters to be seen as legit in these different communities. So I'm still thinking about it. But yeah, I would be that person who walks in with the, exercise biology degree and been doing CrossFit for a couple of years and sitting next to the person who is their first time. And that would piss me off.
Yeah, totally. Especially like someone like yourself too, that is a teacher trainer, and like you're teaching anatomy to other teachers and coaches, and like here you are now like as a student again, like with people that like really have no like biomechanical background.
Yeah.
Even from just like a self experimented space, like that, like people literally, like I'm also talking about like at my certification anyway back in 2011 is like there were people that had never even like done CrossFit physically before, like, which was like a big kind of like, wait, what? Like, why don't you just like go to a gym and like, most gyms will give you a free class, like at least just like check it out, like
try it out. Yeah. But then also from like the business standpoint of stuff, you want to make your trainings accessible,
right?
And putting up those barriers limits people, but then it changes the experience in the room. And like, does it work? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think at a minimum, all trainings, like read a book or something. Like, oh, you have to read this book before you come, or this manual, so that we can start on the same page.
Somewhere, right? It's like your basic, right? Like basic classroom etiquette, right? The teacher gives you a reading assignment,
yeah,
and then you come back the next day, like supposedly having read it,
right?
So that,
well, yeah, I was gonna say, at least then you have the opportunity to choose not to read it,
right. But definitely, yeah, it changes the experience, and also to your experience with level 1, like you were still familiar with Jill and her work.
No, I'd never taken a yoga tune-up class.
But like, I thought you were, remember, because like
I took one like hour-long thing.
You knew who Jill was.
Not like outside of that convention experience. I mean, yes, we had met in person, but it was like in our street clothes talking.
Right, but I thought the whole like encounter was like, some person embarrassed you because they were like, yeah, she's your biggest fan. Like,
well, yeah, because I mean, for me, and actually, just this past week in my classes, I felt like somebody had that similar experience, coming from the biomechanics background and having learned all this anatomy, and then totally not using it when you teach yoga. To be in a room and hear somebody speaking intelligently and using anatomical language and directions of movement, I was just like, oh my god.
Yeah.
And so like I had a student this week who was just like, How do I do that? I want to do the gym. I'm like, great, like come on board, join the club.
Yeah. No, that's really cool, and that definitely is a nice validation of like what that community is looking to continue to birth.
Yeah.
And I think especially, and that's why I have so much appreciation and desire for these types of certifications that are still kind of more new than like some of this more kind of commercialized like ACE and NASA, the mainstream stuff, because like that's also the stuff that like they're up against the same problems that like traditional academia is up against, which is like it's hard to catch up with the times, like you have to go through so much like red tape to update the textbooks, and versus like more of a kind of marketplace process in which like there's less people to respond to, and Andreo Spina can change his PowerPoint at the last minute if he chooses. Which is very different than ACE giving like nutrition advice that, is potentially still going off of the, USDA like recommendations. And that to me is like, whoa, that's a little disconcerting.
Yeah. So do you feel like this was a training where you walked out with like, okay, here's 5 things or 3 things I can put to use right away?
I'll say this. I was really excited with the expectations that I was going to get a lot of answers to my questions. And I just walked away with a lot more questions, which is, funny because that was like, this has been a reoccurring theme. And
we talk about that all the time.
and it's good to have this platform to discuss that, because I'll tell you, I was frustrated, in a good intellectual way, but just overwhelmed with man, I feel like, it's just, here's a bunch of stuff, and now I want to I put a lot of pressure on myself to really want to make sure I'm understanding it, and also kind of going back in my mind and thinking about some of the conclusions I have made for the reasons I've done certain things with my clients or with myself, and wanting to reassess that. While I feel like I was able to connect the dots and really see many more gross similarities between himself and Jill and Kelly, my other mentors. He also said a lot of stuff that, flew in the face of that stuff. And he's known to be kind of anti on the foam rolling side of things. And so
even with other manual therapy tools?
See, I don't think he's familiar with the Yoga Tune-Up products, and I'd be interested to kind of give him a better sense of that for him to reevaluate. But he's to him, kind of coming from his interpretation of the literature, he does not feel that what we claim is myofascial release is really happening, and that this idea of myofascial release is a little bit of a misnomer, and some of our reasons for why we use it are maybe not exactly right. But that point in and of itself brings up another interesting point of this idea of just because we may not have the right justification for doing something or the right reasoning behind why we're doing it doesn't necessarily invalidate it as it being a successful practice. Right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the big things within the paleo community, for instance, in which maybe the caveman story, or maybe, how you're thinking about evolutionary biology may not be correctly lined up with then how we inform our decisions to eat. But what we do know is that when we have people eating these ways, regardless of the story we attach to it, we're seeing good outcomes. So being able to separate the two, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater type of thing, being careful that just because maybe we don't have the best understanding of what's happening, we're still figuring out, and the justifications we're giving, doesn't mean that the practice is useless.
Yeah. It also, I know people are working on developing studies, and sometimes I'm frustrated when people are like, well, has there been a study? And whatever it is, not just this alone.
Right.
And that the scientific method defines all things.
Yeah.
Because even that, to me, I was reading a study about diaphragm fatigability, and they were, looking at a segment of people who had low back pain, non-specific low back pain, so not attributed to any pathology, at least 3 times in the last 6 months. And then they had the control group who hadn't had anything. But the sample size was so small, and based on research science, it means nothing because the sample size was so small. They're just drawing these conclusions. But you're saying, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But so I'm just supposed to discount, the thousands of people who share these stories, my own personal experience, because some scientist hasn't found it to be true like 10 times, because then that's the other piece about research is, it's not just, oh, I did this one research study and it worked out, but can we replicate it and get the same results every single time?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, to his credit, like he was very much a proponent of that. Like, we cannot wait, like this idea of evidence-based research is very misleading, that like we're never going to, like if we're waiting for the evidence, like we're never going to really discover anything of value, and we're going to definitely be behind the curve. What I do think is interesting though, and this is where like I would be interested in his response after, some better understanding of kind of the yoga tune-up tools, is I was speaking to him about some of the controlled articulation stuff that he does, and he was making the point about the ability to kind of internally cue, and how like so many of us, where we're at a loss is we can only rely on external cues, like being able to really to like only be able to touch something or feel something, but like to his point of like you need to be able to like actually kind of like interocept, right, the different vertebrae. And that's where I think the argument or even the discussion changes within the yoga tune-up context, in which when we start talking about how these tools are meant to increase proprioception and it's meant to help and assist this internal cueing process and the ability to kind of feed more of this neuro regulation, as opposed to the more common act of mobilizing, which is like, I'm just sort of like beating up some stiff stuff. Like I'm trying to get rid of the stiffness, and I'm, smashing this or smashing that, versus like, again, the fine tuning process that is, I think very much goes beyond fascia. And his point was that like, this whole fascia thing has been great, like the kind of like revival of fascia.
This whole fascia thing.
As it relates
that fascia.
That fascia stuff, as it relates to Thomas Myers, right? And the change, like, he was a big player in changing the conversation for us to understand more of the connectivity. But his point now is that like, now we need to we need to take the connectivity concept and continue to build that, not like just like go off in a corner and be like only obsessed about fascia, that like, like the whole point of like what fascia taught us was that like, hey, like it is a big bundle of stuff, and it's, all these layers. He has this concept that he refers to as like bioflow anatomy, and that, kind of understanding the layers as being so contiguous that it doesn't even matter at times to really refer to specific locations or even insertion or origin. When he's talking about, and his work is very focused on isometric contraction and the ability to stretch in a manner that recruits so many motor units through the process of different angular isometric contractions. But even with that, he makes a point to say like, don't try and say like this muscle or that muscle. He's like, this stuff on the front and this stuff here, he's always like referring to like contract all of that stuff. And like, but to just really reinforce the point that like, it doesn't matter. And he was, citing literature that showed how, we have this sense of like, oh, when you do this movement, your glute fires first and then your hamstring fires second. We think there's this whole order of operations, but like the research shows us that, somebody did a movement and it was like this order, then they did the same movement. It was like a totally different recruitment, to really make the point that the body doesn't have these like memorized patterns. Like there's no squat button in the brain, and that really every time the body squats, it's actually doing it differently. Even though, which is very much like a paradigm shift to this idea of like, like, oh, we are fine tuning the squat, so the squat is perfect every time. And his point is like that's not what you want to be doing. Like the more variability you can encourage with the body, the more essentially like confidence the nervous system can have in variability is what is going to allow for proficiency as a whole. But like if you're thinking about like only trying to like rote memorize the body with like the perfect squat program, so when you press, when like little Jared like says to big Jared like it's time to squat, like it's it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, the interconnectedness of the body, and you talking about learning more stuff. The more I learn, the less I know.
Yeah.
And when I was in the cadaver lab with Gil Headley, and the only space and separations and differentiations you're seeing in the body are the ones that you created with your scalpel.
Yeah.
And even the idea of, you would get, for some of the forms, the bodies, you would get their health history and how they died. And it's like, oh, ovarian cancer killed you, but the ovaries aren't required for life. Like, I know people who don't have any anymore.
Yeah.
So we understand, I think, so little of how the body moves. And it's just amazing. I love it when people come up to me and they're like, oh, well, this happened. Is that normal? I'm like, I have no idea. Yeah. That's so cool.
Right. And that idea too, like no two shoulders are the same.
No.
And like, that's where he makes this big point about like, hardware versus software, that he's a big believer in. Like the software is so complex.
Yeah.
Stop trying to game it. Like stop trying to, like, we don't understand it. But like, if you can build better resiliency within your tissues and better articular freedom, then like if the nervous system has a little glitch, right? Like you're squatting and the foot happens to turn out a little bit and you lose a little bit of torque, like that shouldn't break you.
Yeah.
And I think one of his other, this is like an interesting topic, like food for thought, one of his critiques within sort of the foam rolling or, self-massage space is that like, him saying that if there's a person that has to foam roll, let's just say, or roll their ankles every time before they squat in order to even get into enough dorsiflexion to just like be in that basic shape, then his point is that the nervous system is not confident enough with that position in the first place, that like you do not have enough of the prerequisite to execute this movement safely. And that's like the nervous system's way of telling you that. And you're essentially just like disguising that every time by you being able to kind of, foam roll the issue away temporarily. So it seems like you're good to go. But his point was like, I would actually warrant caution if you're having to do that every time. It's suggestible that like that tissue resiliency, the load bearing capacity is not quite there. And it's when that load bearing capacity is less than, the load that is absorbed, now we're going to have some injury. And now it's not as mysterious as, people make it out to be like, oh my God, this just happened, when really it was like, well, like that aspect of prerequisite was a little lost. And that's what's hard, I think.
Yeah. And being prepared for any type of movement. I mean, that's what we do.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to move people through novel positions that they haven't done today. You mentioned, like, I feel like it was a long time ago, but the CARs that Andreo Spina does, the controlled articular
rotations.
Yeah.
So,
and that alone, so, just taking the shoulder through its full range of motion, for so many people, they don't do that ever. And they're like, well, why are my shoulders so jacked up? Because you move them in the same position all day. It's the same 3 degrees forward to hold onto your steering wheel or put your hands on a keyboard, and then another 3 degrees back to hang by your side. It's just this repetition of stuff, and then expecting to be able to go into the gym or into the yoga studio and, even though I haven't raised my arms overhead all day, now I'm going to do it 50 times with weight and see what happens.
Yeah. And when you take a step back like that, like like the logic starts to like be so glaringly obvious that it's like almost insulting. It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, like I
Duh.
only lift my arms overhead the hour that I'm in the gym. It's like, well, okay, like now, like this kind of changes the discussion now, right? Like,
Totally.
as opposed to, why can't I do this? But the cars thing is really fascinating, and that's his homework to everyone is like, you should be doing these controlled articular rotations for every joint in your body, your spine, your scapula, your shoulders, your elbow, your wrists, your hips, your knees, and your ankles every morning as soon after you wake up.
Move it or lose it.
Move it or lose it, yeah. And, at the very least, being able to go 2 rotations per each joint in both directions, and just bring it on. And it's cool because CARS functions as not only a rehabilitation or mobilization type of exercise, but it's the most diagnostic and assessment-based thing you can do for yourself. Mm-hmm. And so he, like, not only does he give that, like, that's his sort of gift to the world, saying like, hey, like, let's start sort of just attacking this lowest hanging fruit with these controlled articular rotations every time we wake up. But also, that's his MO for his clients that he sees in his chiropractic space for how they know when they need to see him again. That if you're doing that controlled articular rotation and you have a pinch on the closed angle, the like more regressive angle versus, so like if you're doing the rotation at your head and you have kind of like a pinch on the shortened side versus like just something that feels tight on the long side, then that indicates something that is a little bit more needing of some manual help versus, something that is just like on the open angle kind of tightness, then that's right. Something that, is more accessible for you to work through. And just having like a little bit of that knowledge beforehand is that empowerment piece that and I think is great.
And the awareness of the interoception.
Right, exactly.
That you're moving this way so often that you're able to notice what's different.
Yeah.
Joe DeFranco, who also has a podcast, and I'm totally blanking on what's his show name? Do you know?
I think it just has his name in it. Like.
Yeah. Well, anyways, he was saying like, this made me think of it. One of the most diagnostic things you can do for clients, like, hey, how are you? Like, what did you do this week?
Right.
And then that story, that, but that's still from the coach standpoint. I'm trying to weed it out of you and then make my own story based on what you said. So the cool thing about the, going through the range of motion with the CARS is that it empowers the client, the person, individual, to be responsible, to go through the movements, to be listening, to be paying attention. And then they can tell you, hey, this is what I found. Or like you're saying, oh, I'm feeling the pinch and that's something I need to get checked out, as opposed to relying on somebody else always to give you the answer.
Right. Totally. It's, I don't know. I find it still so hard to communicate that to clients. It is, and in some ways, like it seems so simple, like that prescription too, that that they're almost kind of skeptical of it. But like,
hey, what is it? Teach or fish for a man, feed him for a day, teach him to fish, and feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. But, when people are like, oh, my back, like it's spasmed up, like what should I do? And honestly, like one of the best things you could do is like do some controlled articular rotations at the hip joint, like get it moving. And like to them, they're kind of like, oh, but that, like, what can I do? Like, is there...
Can't I just put something right here and make the pain go away instantly? No, you have to work.
Yeah. There's a little bit of a climb that you're going to have to go through there.
It's tough to be a human.
Tough to be a human. This is for sure.
Well, it's like the technology makes everything so easy. Like this week, I ordered groceries on Prime now, so like you don't even have to leave your house to get groceries anymore. So well now I don't have to walk. You know, I'm just like it's so awesome and helpful, but at the same time, we're destroying our bodies with modern day conveniences.
This is true, especially when those types of errands, right, can be ways in which you integrate the self-care or the movement supplement that you're not getting when your life requires sitting at a desk, driving to and from work, sleeping, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So what do you think is next for you as far as continuing education? Are you going to go on a bender and just like take courses every month? What is next, Jared Cohen?
No, I think the mistake I made too is like doing this right now is that it's like I can't even really and well the problem is I've been trying to like continue to have my undivided attention on the stuff I learned, but yet like I have all this stuff for my master's program that is like totally falling to the wayside. And so like that's the kind of issue I'm having too, where it's like the reality is like this, like I'm in this whole program of continuing education, and yet like, and so I need to kind of figure out how to be a little bit more like somewhat narrow-minded in the task, and not spread myself too thin, as well as wanting to utilize a lot of the stuff I learned this weekend. But what I continue to realize over and over when I do this stuff is like I'm always seeking out the type of continuing education courses within this health and fitness space that are very, very detail-oriented, which don't always lend themselves so well to the like hour class setting that I'm most of the time teaching within. And that's like, and it's like, no wonder I'm like frustrated that I can't like express more. So, that's kind of the hard part as well. But I did do a yoga tune-up mobility movement class, whatever you want to call it, this weekend, and it was nice to be able to do some rolling and then incorporate some of Spina's stuff. He's his new program that he's launching is called Kin Stretch, which stands for kinetic stretching, and it's basically his version of what would be kind of like a yoga flow class, but very similar to, Jill's process and really trying to like kind of like take out a lot of the decoration that yoga has that is distracting for a lot of people, and also reinsert a lot more of the biomechanical validity is kind of what he's doing in his version that he's calling Kin Stretch. And it's also his system being applied within a class setting that incorporates his cars and a bunch of his other kind of exercise modalities that he uses to train the body to develop more of that motor recruitment that a lot of times we're missing, and therefore can't display as much control over our ranges. So taking some of that was a nice additive, within some of the other yoga tune-up stuff that I would normally do. And it also, actually, the other thing that was kind of a nice connect the dots aha moment for me was that in yoga tune-up, a lot of Jill's stuff actually also really uses these ideas of isometric. You think about like so much of the cues for positions in the yoga tune-up literature is like act like you're doing a movement without actually doing it, right? Which is the isometric. And it's kind of like his is just like a little bit more specific about like what's actually like kind of happening there, beyond just the PNF kind of like, oh, contract, relax. But like, no, like it's not just like necessarily contracting, but it's also like, you're trying to engage this force against that force, and create that position of tension to retrain the body that in a way that it hasn't quite been talked to yet, which is sometimes also misleading because like that requires work and it requires like activation, and a lot of times people are thinking like, oh, yoga and mobility, like I'm just like passively, like
yeah, I'm just hanging out.
Yeah, I'm just hanging out, and that's part of the problem too, is that people are going to these classes thinking that like it's self-guided sauna work, when like really in some ways like you are going to be working harder to like really kind of wake up the system, right? We're talking to things that haven't been talked to, and there's frustration with that in the same way that like it's frustrating when you're learning something you don't quite understand and you're trying to make sense of it. It's frustrating to realize that, hey, like my shoulder is not, like I can't do, like, this controlled articular rotation at the shoulder is just continues to be fascinating with me, with how starting classes, it, like people cannot, like they can't even extend the elbow, like disassociate just that. Once they get to this end range, the ability to like internally rotate and go into extension becomes like just this total breakdown from inside. So, like to me, it's like, wow, like this is enlightening, but it's also a little worrisome because now I'm asking them to do some other, intense stuff.
And you're like, do we have 4 hours?
Yeah, it's like, guys, stop everything you're doing. Get on a ball.
Yeah. Well, that's super exciting. And that's awesome that you were able to go out and do something and get excited over some new stuff. It's always, I'm totally one of those people who's out, looking at stuff and reading things. And I don't always get to go to a course, which I think is the most not formula, I'm trying to think like a formal way to learn things. But I know that for so many coaches and teachers, whether it be yoga, Pilates, personal training, even physical therapists, like whatever, that continuing education is so important.
Yeah.
To keep you at the cutting edge, but also to keep you curious and fun, to have something to be excited about as opposed to just like doing the basics.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember having that realization from like the early days of coaching when the first person I worked for, he made this comment like, there's only so many ways to teach the squat, it gets boring. And I just remember thinking like, well, it only gets boring if you're continuing to use the same ways to teach it, but like to me, it was like this moment of like, oh, I'm gonna continue to like just learn different pieces of this puzzle and like then continue to re-excite the process because like it's another, now it's a new piece to insert back to, this otherwise more basic shape.
Well, and it's novel for you, and it's novel for the people. I mean, we already talked about how every person is so different. Every squat from moment to moment is so different. You can't approach it the same way every time and expect better or different results.
Yeah, definitely. And Elizabeth Gilbert, Curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I have 26 minutes left on my audiobook of Big Magic. Which I highly recommend.
Yes, I second that.
It has been one of the best things I've read in a while. That just like it's so comforting and inspiring, and like the right reminder, just that like you need all the time about this whole thing of being curious and working in a manner that doesn't have to be so gut-wrenching, and actually enjoyable and expressive. And that's like, I think we all need that reminder because, even this experience for me was like, was stressful in, the time commitment, but also just like the reorganization of my thoughts on training. And it's always hard for me because I've like continued to work in spaces in which like I'm like the only one getting this continuing education, and then like go back to work and I don't like have the social support to engage in like the dialogue about, to kind of work through some of these things, especially as it relates to the practice that I'm coaching in most of the time, which is CrossFit. But nonetheless, to take a step back and be like, hey, like curiosity, like frame it in terms of curiosity, and it doesn't have to be so life or death.
So the fact that you came home with many questions, we would say is a win.
It's a win. That's right. That's right.
Well, I think we're getting close to time for today's episode. I feel like even just talking about creativity and curiosity and reframing coaching for another episode, I'm excited.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any quotes you wanna leave us with?
Do you have one you'd like to share?
I'm searching through right now. I've written a few down.
What you got?
In the past couple days. Okay, so I'm gonna give kind of like three here. They all kind of piggyback on each other. This is from Legacy by James Kerr, the book that talks about leadership and successful habits through the lens of the All Blacks New Zealand rugby team. And this first quote, I believe, is from James Kerr as he's commenting on some of the other people that he interviewed. And he says, "Leaders are teachers. Our job is to lead people through confusion and uncertainty into self-knowledge and self-possession. Successful leaders look beyond their own field to discover new approaches, learn best practices, and push the margins. They then pass on what they have learned." And then this second quote that follows is by a coach, Bill Walsh. And he says, "The ability to help the people around me self-actualize their goals underlies the single aspect of my abilities and the one label I value the most, teacher." And I was just like, oh God, it's beautiful.
That's good.
And lastly here, this is back to James Kerr, his distillation of all this, in which he says, "The first stage of learning is silence. The second stage is listening."
So awesome.
So awesome.
Those are awesome. All right. I'm not even going to try because those are like three perfect ones. We'll just leave that simmering right there.
Simmer. Maybe so much so we'll have to repeat those in future episodes. Or my idea is to give these quotes to some of the future guests we have and have them reflect and maybe provide a little on-the-spot response to those words.
Totally. Well, until next time, Jared, where can people find you on the interwebs?
People can find me at cpbgrowth.com, as well as It's Deraj, ITSDERAJ on Instagram, and Jared Cohen on Facebook. There's a few of us, so you'll have to browse that. I'm not the Jared Cohen that works for Google.
Shoot.
Secretly, I'm a little jealous of how much Google space he takes up, but it's cool.
And show notes from this episode and all other episodes and past episodes and hopefully future episodes, depending on when you're listening to this, live at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. And I'm on the interwebs at Holla for Mala and aewellness.com.
Perfect. Thank you for listening. As always, till next time.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium. Unveiling the Coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at BehindThePodiumPodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.